Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello and a warm welcome to this edition of Business Africa. I'm your host, Afolake Onyiloye. The top stories this week. Can the so-called BRICS countries successfully facilitate a viable alternative to the US dollar? Well, they set themselves an August timeline. With over 87% of all arrivals, Ugandan airline bask in the growth of passenger numbers at Entebbe International Airport. As banks in the United States register potential losses of up to $620 billion in 2022, African institutions call for reforms and urge investment in the continent's markets. The ongoing global financial crunch and confrontational U.S. foreign policy could explain why the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have stepped up efforts to launch an alternative currency to the U.S. dollar. In this report, we answer several questions, including what is required to make this vision a reality and the possible implications of this move to African economies.
The US dollar has been the official reserve currency of the world since 1944, when the decision was made by a delegation from 44 allied countries called the Bretton Woods Agreement. The decision effectively gave the US dollar dominance in global markets as it became the currency used for trading oil and other commodities. However, not everyone likes playing by US rules, and countries like Russia and China, who are highly vulnerable to Western sanctions that weaponize the US dollar, are keen to bring a halt to the dollar hegemony. It is against this backdrop that the BRICS collective, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is working on a common currency in an attempt to ditch the US dollar and push back against America's dominance. These countries argue that the de-dollarization process, as it is called, would reduce other countries' dependence on the US dollar and minimize exposure to currency fluctuations and interest rates changes. This would in turn mitigate the impact of economic and political changes in the US on their own economies, in addition to improving economic stability and reducing the risk of financial crisis. If the BRICS nations successfully establish a new currency, some analysts say this could help stabilize their economies. For an investor in BRICS countries, it would mean increased consumer confidence that would also lead to an uptick in spending and economic growth.
Ali Kensatru, an economist and the CEO of Rich Management Limited, joins us from Kenya for more on that report. Welcome to the show. Now, to begin with, who will benefit from this move?
I think it helps the BRICS countries, obviously, Russia, China in particular, who are most at risk of being sanctioned. But it also helps the rest of the world, because it allows the rest of the world to use their own local currencies more going forward, and it allows them to escape from the dollar. I think the BRICS currency is going to be a currency for trading purposes, but behind that you will still have your own local currency. But when you come to do a trade exchange, it's likely that you're going to use this currency. So I think it's advantageous for the rest of the world, and I think that's why there is so much impetus behind it.
Now, what are African countries saying about this move, and how will it impact their economies?
So it's interesting. I think African countries have been quite quiet, except for South Africa, where particularly the foreign minister has been quite forthright in her opinions. I think African countries are watching from the sidelines. I think, they're currently under tremendous pressure because of inflation, shortage of dollars. So they're feeling the pain from the dollar-dominated economy. And therefore, I think they're going to look at this as giving them some kind of safety valve in the current scenario. So I fully expect African countries to embrace the BRICS currencies. I mean, you just have to look at Africa's trade. Our biggest trading partner today is China. We need commodities. And therefore, I suspect African countries will embrace such a currency and such an option going forward.
Now, wouldn't this put African economies in the precarious situation given the influence of the dollar on its various economies?
So I think the precarious position, which you're probably referring to, is a geopolitical, geoeconomic position in that we've seen the US re-engage with the African continent because they felt that the African continent wasn't moving in the direction they wanted it to move, particularly with the Ukraine war. We saw the visits of Kamala Harris. We saw various, Blinken was in town. We saw a lot of engagement. And I think so far that's been kind of velvet glove. But, should Africa really embrace this direction, and I think, we'll see a different type of engagement, which might be significantly more aggressive. So I think overall, it's a positive step. Of course, as I said, Africa's got to trade gingerly. We're not China, we're not Russia. We've got to be careful how we make our moves between these two big superpowers. But overall, I think given the scenario which we're in, it's clearly obvious that this gives us some optionality and therefore potential improvement of what is a very difficult situation for the continent right now. Heavy debts, high debt servicing costs, expensive commodities. It's going to be tricky, but I think this gives us some options.
Mr. Sancho, thanks for those insights.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Uganda's Civil Aviation Authority says it has registered an 87% recovery in air passenger traffic at Entebbe International Airport, an indication that the country is pulling away from the COVID-19 slump. We assess the situation on the ground through the eyes of the national carrier, Ugandan Airlines.
Taking to the skies at full capacity, Uganda Airlines is spreading its wings deeper on the continent, a sign of recovery. The airline managers say increased passenger traffic is pushing them to open up new routes.
Ever since the skies opened early in 2022, there is a lot of enthusiasm in the aviation space. You find that people want to travel more, people want to go on holidays, people want to go back to school, people want to go about their business.
Officials at Uganda Airlines say tourists and businessmen make up the biggest percentage of passengers. Currently, Entebbe International Airport is handling close to 5,000 passengers per day compared to about 3,500 passengers at the same time last year.
The numbers are continuing to grow, but for various reasons, one of them being the relaxation of these previously stringent COVID-19 requirements. You remember there was a time when there were COVID tests that had to be undertaken at various airports across the world. These have since been removed.
And as more countries relax their restrictions, African airlines are buying new fleets and taking advantage of increased passengers.
The International Civil Aviation Organization had projected that Africa generally will get back to near normal, to pre-COVID level in the year 2024. From the statistics that we are seeing, at least for Uganda in particular, by the end of 2023, we should most likely be back to the level at which we were in 2019 before the advent of COVID-19.
But as business gradually picks up at Entebbe Airport, overcoming the turbulence in the industry caused by COVID-19 could take some time. Hilary Isga, Africanews, Kampala.
African bond assets can be a credible alternative for investors seeking to diversify their portfolios. Several African institutions are calling for a reform of the global financial architecture, as a review of potential U.S. bank losses in 2022 shows that African bond assets are a less risky alternative for investors.
For some time now, several African institutions, including UNECA and the African Development Bank, have been calling for a reform of the global financial architecture where Africa would receive more attention from international private investors. With the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the U.S. reporting potential losses of $620 billion in 2022 for banks in the market, it would seem that mature financial markets are becoming more complex, and therefore investors should be looking for alternatives. investors will be looking at the much publicized fall of the Silicon Valley Bank and other medium-sized U.S. banks, the central bank's decision to raise key interest rates, and making the inevitable conclusion that the financial system in the U.S. right now is weak and not a reliable investment option. The alternative is therefore to assess the viability of investing in emerging and developing markets, such as those in Africa. The region's overall debt, analyzed differently, shows that between 2017 and 2021, African governments paid an annual average of $19 billion in debt servicing, ensuring that there are very few bankruptcies or bond losses. A counter-argument to this idea is that African countries face even higher inflation and risks of exchange rate depreciation.
And that's all we had for you this week on Business Africa. Thanks for joining us. For more business news and stories, stay tuned to Africanews and Africanews.com.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.